In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to control the rendering properties of individual objects in our scene. Okay, so now we have our material set up, and everything for the most part is starting to look really nice. So really there's just a few minor little things that we want to come in and make some adjustments to, possibly at this point. So one of the things that we can do is come in and actually make some changes to the way individual objects render whenever that time comes. So for example, let's say we have a certain object in our scene, maybe something like this little floor, this little landing pad here. Let's say maybe for whatever reason we didn't want this to be visible, or maybe we didn't want it to cast shadows. Well, what we could do is right-click, and on this object go to Object Properties. Now in this Object Properties window we can start to access some of the rendering controls. So we can control whether or not this object is going to be visible, whether or not it's going to be seen by the camera, whether it is going to be seen in any other object's reflections or refractions, if this object is able to receive any shadows on itself, if it's able to cast shadows onto other objects, and if there are any atmospherics applied to it. So for example, let's say maybe we wanted this object to not be seen by the camera. We'll hit OK, and the next time we render this out, we can see that the object itself, just as we've said, is no longer being seen by the camera, although it does still cast shadows, and if we had any reflective objects in the scene, it should still show up in any other object's reflections. But this can be one useful way if maybe you have an object in the scene that maybe you want to still have reflected in other objects, if you want it to be seen by other indirect illumination sources, but you just don't want it to get in the way of the camera. Well, there you go. You can easily do that. Let's go in and maybe turn that back on. Another really useful thing that we could do is maybe for something like these particles. If we are rendering these particles and they're really soft, really not a whole lot of shadows that are going to be seen on these, well, because it really won't make much of a difference as far as the visual quality, what we could do is go into these particles and make sure that they are set to not cast or receive any shadows. So that should help save us a little bit of render time. So now the 3ds Max won't even worry about calculating shadows on these particles, and like I said, that's just one less thing that we have to worry about. So if we come in and render that out, visually it shouldn't look any different, but it might help shave just a couple of seconds off of our render. There we go, very nice. So again, really not much of an impact here as far as the overall visual quality, but it can help shave just a little bit of time off of our renders. Another thing we could also do with these particles selected is we can go into Metal Ray, and let's maybe tell these to just be invisible to the final gather effect. Again, that might help us to sort of minimize some of the impact that we might start to see at render time, but visually it shouldn't make much of a difference at all. There we are, very nice. So the ability to come in here and take individual objects and set exactly how that object is going to be rendered, it's actually a very useful feature, and one that as you start to get a little bit deeper into the rendering process and start to render out your own scenes, you'll definitely find yourself using this for certain situations where it just becomes a lifesaver. There may not be a whole lot of situations where you really need to get in here, but for those 1 or 2 instances where you really need this control, you'll be very glad that you have it. Okay, so that's a look at how we can start to access the rendering controls of individual objects found in our scene.